I think South Australia's been fortunate to have a set of progressive reformers as leaders. You know, you think to Don Dunstan, Lynn Arnold, Mike Rann, and the current government as well. I think Jay thinks hard about the distribution of income and about placing fairness not as a peripheral issue, but as an issue that's central to what the government does. And that governments can't change everything, but they can have an impact. And South Australia's been fortunate in that the egalitarian ethos of progressive parties, and maybe also we ought to give a little bit of credit to the Conservatives. If there's one place where noblesse oblige seems to retain a little foothold, it's probably more so in the right in South Australia than in other cases where the ideology of Thatcher and Reagan seems to have more strongly dominated the Conservative side of politics. Good sport involves making sure that people have the same starting point. So the Kentucky Derby in the US is, I think, a less interesting race than the Melbourne Cup, partly because the Melbourne Cup places lead in the saddlebags, so it's pretty unpredictable who's going to win. AFL is a more redistributive game than English Premier League. Much more equal sharing of the TV revenues, use of salary caps and player drafts to make sure that talent is evenly shared across. And as a result, AFL is, I think, a more unpredictable game than English Premier League. You know, you have Man U that's won more than half the championships over the last 2 decades. By contrast, in AFL, no team's won more than 3 premierships over the last 2 decades. And the story of the Crows in the late 1990s is classic rags to riches to rags. That makes for a great outcome from a spectator's point of view, if maybe not for the point of view of South Australians with their heart in their mouths, and illustrates, I think, that while we might not want to put lead in the saddlebags in the race of life, we probably do want to think about providing a pair of shoes to the kid who's currently about to run barefoot, starting 10 metres behind the starting line. I think there's an enormous amount of luck in terms of the circumstances of your birth. You know, I was fortunate to have or am fortunate to have a couple of extraordinary parents and to grow up in comfortable circumstances in one of the richest nations in the world at an extraordinarily affluent time in human history. By contrast, if I'd been born a few thousand years ago, what would have mattered is my poor eyesight and my slight build, which might well have seen me eaten by a saber-toothed tiger somewhere on the savannah. And so that's luck. I mean, Warren Buffett has talked about this, about the fact that his particular talents for money management would have essentially brought no returns just a few hundred years earlier, but now have made him, you know, one of the richest people in the history of the world. And so we ought to recognise the role of luck in success. And those of us who've been fortunate need to recognise that provides an obligation to assist those who haven't been as fortunate. This is not as good a time to be an inarticulate bloke who's good with his hands looking for a job as it was a generation ago. And that's not the fault of any of those individuals, and public policy has to recognise that. Absolutely. I think there's it's important that you maintain a set of passions and ideals, but they have to be about the ends, not the means. I worked for a summer in the US for the Progressive Policy Institute, which is doing training for potential state legislators in the US, and they'd get them to talk about what they're passionate about. And they'd say, oh, I'm passionate about Medicare, or I'm passionate about Social Security, or I'm passionate about the subsidy program for low-skill inner-city youth. And the Democrats who are running this would say, no, 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 no. They're programs, they're not values. Tell us the values you're passionate about. And we'll start from there, and then you can see which programs you want to support. But we ought to always be, as progressives, I think, be scientific and critical about the ability of any individual program to make the world a better place. We do the most vulnerable no favours by tying ourselves blindly to particular policies. There are great social programs and lousy social programs, and progressives need to be in the business of sorting one from the other. I think it's vital, because ultimately you can only, through direct conversations, be in touch with a tiny slice of the human condition. And what great novelists allow you to do is to tap into a broader swath of the human spirit. I don't read as many novels as I'd like to, but I was struck recently by a piece in the New York Times which was looking at the effect that Harry Potter has on attitudes of young Americans and young Europeans towards minorities, and saying that those who've read Harry Potter are much more likely to be sensitive towards refugees and towards gay and lesbian classmates, and essentially making the argument that a lot of Harry Potter is about developing a sense of empathy to those who are mistreated for factors that are outside their control. The scathing, sort of referring to people as mudbloods and all that sort of thing. And it's one little illustration of how fiction can help make us better people.
Who's your favourite novelist?
Wow, who am I enjoying at the moment? I like Ian McEwan. The early stuff more than the latest stuff. Tim Winton, I think, is clearly our kind of national sort of storyteller. And actually, I've only probably spent all up about 3 or 4 months in Western Australia. So really, what I see when I go to Western Australia is Tim Winton landscapes. Tim Winton seems to be WA for me. It's hard to go past President Obama, I think, in terms of somebody who has taken some chances and made a difference for the not just racial relations, but also the kind of dignity of public debate in the United States. It's Obama's misfortune that he's come to office at a time when American politics is as fractious and polarised as it's ever been in the last couple of 100 years. But I think he's a model in terms of how to articulate an argument, the cool disposition, and the willingness to not shy away from complexity, to use a speech, for example, to answer the Josiah Wright critique during the 2008 campaign was pretty impressive to me. I mean, the fact that Labor didn't control the House of Representatives from 2010 to 2013 was particularly unusual. It wasn't that unusual that President Obama didn't control Congress. Well, in the first 2008 to 2010, he wasn't veto-proof, wasn't filibuster-proof in the Senate, and then he lost the House from 2010. That's pretty normal for US presidents. It was very abnormal for Julia Gillard not to control the House, and the circumstances of the broken promise around a carbon tax, I think, were brutally fatal in ways that I certainly didn't anticipate at the outset. take the lifetime of my maternal grandfather, who passed away last weekend, aged 92. For the first 2/3 of his life, Australia was becoming a more equal place. Year on year, incomes were going up faster in the middle and the bottom than at the top. And then just over the last generation, the last 30 years of his life, things turned around and Australia became a more unequal place. Now, we're better in many other ways than the Australia of the 1960s, but there's some of that egalitarian spirit of the 60s that I think would be worth reclaiming, and which I think an egalitarian like my late grandfather greatly admired and enjoyed. We're a nation that doesn't much like tipping, where we sit in the front seat of taxis, we don't have private areas on the beaches, and we don't stand up when the Prime Minister enters the room. We've had former senior bankers called Nugget and Nobby and a billionaire called Twiggy. And there's something about that egalitarian Australia which I think we ought to hold pretty precious, and which I'm worried is threatened by this big rise in inequality that we've seen over the last generation, in earnings, in wealth, and particularly at the very top of the distribution. I think there's a growing awareness of the importance of the issue of inequality, but it is a big shift among progressives right around the world. I think Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, Paul Keating, all were vital economic reformers for the progressive side of politics, but none of them talked about the gap between rich and poor very much. By contrast, Barack Obama has given important speeches on inequality. Ed Miliband has been talking a lot about the distribution of income, and first spearheaded, I think, by Wayne Swan with his Bruce Springsteen speech. Australian Labor politicians are very comfortable now talking about not just the average, but also about the distribution. And recognising that, in the old John Rawls sense, if you were about to be born, you would probably want a nation that was more egalitarian than the one we have now, in which a fifth of the top fifth of the population holds 2/3 of the wealth, and the bottom fifth of the population holds less than 1% of the wealth. Just from behind the veil of ignorance, that's a more extreme skew of the wealth distribution than I believe most people would desire. I think equality matters in the sense of ensuring that people are able to survive through shocks. And so, equality, if we simply said, well, let's set everything equal at the starting gate, but then not doing anything after that, well, that's effectively a policy that says if someone loses all their possessions in a natural disaster, we ought to do nothing to help them. So no one really believes in pure equality of opportunity. Invest up to age 5, then do nothing. There's differing levels to which people are committed to equality of outcome, and I think we can do a lot impose a lot of smart policies around making sure our schooling system works as well as it can for the most vulnerable. But everything's a mix between between opportunity and outcome. So incomes affected by the set of policies today, tax policies, education policies, the extent to which unions are able to work to have an equalising effect on the distribution of income. Wealth inequality is, in some sense, capturing some of what went on in the past. The inheritances people were handed, the set of rules around capital gains. Wealth is probably a more useful proxy of power, which is perhaps why we look to the top 200 wealth list rather than top 200 income list. But these are questions which mostly excite policy wonks. The stuff of the inequality debate really is around why all of these measures, wealth, income, consumption, have all gotten worse over the last generation.